I am with Dream Spinner Publications. I am represented by Naomi Davis. I have had 9 books come out since 2019, and they weren't all written in that span of time. I've been very, very fortunate in that when my publisher picked up one book, they basically said, give me everything you've got. And so I went back into all those, those books we keep on our computers that are finished, but we just haven't found the right home, and they bought everything I had. So I've been very lucky in the past 4 years. I'm going to read you the first chapter of Harsh Reality. Harsh Reality is, we market it as Annie Get Your Gun meets Night of the Living Dead meets Survivor. And it's what happens when an author goes to see cowboys and aliens and then has pizza and then goes to bed, and this is what she dreams about. So this is what came from that. Chapter 1. Oblivion, Territory of New Mexico, circa 1891. Shit, them miners don't usually head into the saloon drunk. Those miners, I thought, Ma's voice carrying to me from the grave. Being raised by a schoolmarm meant proper speech stuck with you. I resisted the urge to correct my deputy again. Shifting my weight, I let my chair thump forward onto all 4 of its legs. The porch bore the indentations from years of my abuse, and I rubbed the sole of my leather boot over its uneven surface. Lowering my hat brim against the setting sun, I followed Deputy Baylor's gaze. Sure enough, a trio of men shambled their way up the main dirt street of Oblivion. Nothing new about miners coming into town, but as my deputy had pointed out, these 3 weaved from side to side like the mayor after one of his benders. They dragged their gear behind them in the dust, adding unnecessary damage to picks and shovels. Where were their horses? Maybe they'd been robbed, which made them my problem, regardless of whether or not they started any trouble. A sigh whooshed out of me, and I pushed myself up by the arms of my faithful chair. Think we should have a talk with them, Callie? Baylor's blue eyes twinkled beneath the brim of his hat and dirty blonde bangs. My stare fell on Baylor like a bucket of river water in January. Suddenly, the rail post at the edge of the general store's porch seemed particularly interesting to him. Sorry, Sheriff McCabe. Everyone knew I preferred to be called Sheriff while on duty. Hard enough to maintain authority as a woman without drawing extra attention to my too feminine first name. I rested a hand on Baylor's shoulder. No, I'm sorry, Jake. Just hoping for a nice, quiet Monday, that's all. He stood, his lanky frame too thin for his 6 feet of height, and watched the trio of miners disappearing through the saloon's swinging doors. The tinkling of piano keys I'd barely been aware of ceased drifting across to us on the faint breeze. I don't think you're going to get it. Hank never stopped playing the saloon's old upright, not in the late afternoon while trying to draw in the evening crowd. Neither do I. Tucking my shirt tail into my dungarees, I set off at a brisk pace down the boardwalk lining the street. Baylor kept pace behind me. We paused for 2 horses pulling a creaking wagon to pass, and I took the opportunity to tighten the strip of rawhide holding my long hair in a pleated braid that hung heavy between my shoulder blades. The wagon lumbered on, its noise drowning out any trouble that might have been erupting in the saloon. Miss Callie! Deputy Baylor! Dang it. I glanced at the unmoving wooden doors. No sign of real trouble except the silent piano. I didn't want to stop. I really didn't. But there were certain citizens one couldn't ignore without consequences. I closed my eyes, counted to 3, then pasted on my best Sunday school smile and turned to face the man who'd called to us, aware of Jake doing the same. To Preacher Xanthus, I would forever be Miss Callie, and Jake would be Deputy Baylor. Shiny stars, especially on a woman, meant nothing in the face of religious propriety. Besides, who could argue with a man whose sanity got called into question more often than a bartender poured whiskey? I finished my turn, my nose ending up 3 inches from a bird's beak, and jerked back to avoid losing a nostril or two. "Whoops, sorry, Callie, you startled her is all. You know how much Pandora likes you." A harsh squawk begged to differ. Xanthus put a couple of feet between us, pulling his black-sleeved arm against his chest, the perched bird along with it. Bright gold and scarlet feathers stood out stark against the dark coat fabric. Intense black eyes studied me, head cocking from side to side, giving the impression of a creature of much greater years than the average pet's lifespan. Whether Pandora liked me or not, she certainly found me intriguing. Or maybe tasty. I hoped I'd never find out. That beak looked sharp. Not for the first time, I wondered what kind of bird she was. Not a parrot, and nothing I'd seen in these parts before. "Dangerous animals should be kept in cages," Jake drawled, keeping well clear. I noticed his hand rested on the grip of his 6-shooter. Seriously? He was going to shoot a 12-inch tall bird that hadn't actually harmed anyone? We needed to have a little chat later. "Nothing dangerous about Pandora. You live right by the Lord and she'll leave you be." The preacher stroked her ruffled feathers. "She might speak her mind, but she's never bitten another good soul. Believe me, I'd know it. If she ever did, it would have a purpose." No humor there, and from the tone, it was purpose with a capital P. I wondered if our crazy preacher thought he'd train Pandora as some sort of godly guard bird. He carried the darn thing everywhere, even up to the pulpit on Sundays. Why Oblivion's townsfolk put up with such shenanigans was beyond me, but he was the only preacher we had, and souls, after all, must be saved. Speaking of saving souls, I looked over my shoulder at the saloon across the street. No one had exited or entered the swinging doors after the 3 miners, and I still didn't hear any sounds of distress. No breaking glass, no shouting. Maybe I was worried for nothing. The piano remained silent. Preacher Xanthus cleared his throat for attention. "I noticed you weren't in church yesterday." Of course he had. I'd hoped with all the miners and the families attending, dangerous work made for pious folk, he might have missed my absence. No such luck. Of course, even when I was there, I wasn't. Not really. In body maybe, but not in spirit. And he always noticed that, too. Someone screamed. Jerking my head up, I followed the sound, right into the saloon. I exchanged a quick glance with Jake. My hand found the rawhide loop keeping my pistol in its holster and released it. "Sorry, preacher, gotta go." Without waiting for a response, I raced my partner the rest of the way across the street. Finally. "I'll expect your attendance next Sunday, little lady," Xanthus called after us. Sometimes I wondered if, despite my discretion, he knew about some of the other unladylike things I did beyond being the sheriff. That is when the first body flew through the saloon's front window. Glass, expensive and hard as hell to get out here, shattered in all directions. One of the miners I'd seen earlier hit the boardwalk with a thud and then rolled until he dropped off the edge and settled in the dust. Sounds of fighting poured into the street. I ran the last few steps, crouching on one knee beside the stranger, who lay face up, eyes staring at nothing in the darkening afternoon sky. Cuts crisscrossed his pale cheeks, presumably from the broken panes, but no blood welled up from the wounds. My nose wrinkled at the foul stench, well beyond that of unwashed mail rising off the body, like spoiled meat. Reaching out, I placed 2 fingers against his neck, just to be sure, and recoiled at the chill of the miner's skin. I swiped my hands over the sightless eyes to close the lids, but they popped open again, startling a screech out of me that I covered with a clearing of my throat. So much for that idea. I tried not to look into them as I scanned the rest of the body, noting dark, dry stains, some flaking into the dust, but further inspection revealed no wounds. The blood spattering this miner's clothing wasn't his own, which meant another body somewhere. "Hellfire," I whispered. "What?" Jake said from my right shoulder. From within the bar came crashing and yelling, accompanied by the high-pitched shriek of one of the upstairs girls. But not Arlene. Her shriek and any other excited sound she could make, I knew intimately. Whatever was going on, she'd be smart enough to stay out of the way, I hoped. A couple of whiskey bottles followed the miner through the window and into the street. I ducked as one missed my head by inches. At least it was empty. "Go on, get in there," I shouted over the din. "Put a stop to that before someone else gets killed." "He's dead?" Xanthus asked from my left. "Good and," I assured the preacher while Jake vanished through the swinging doors. Should have been me, I knew, but all my attention was focused on the body in front of me. By all reasonable assessments, this guy had been dead for days. What the hell? Maybe the other two had been carrying this one. That would explain their lurching approach, but why on earth would they go to a saloon with a dead man? And why toss a corpse out a window? Whatever the explanation, and I had to believe there was some reasonable one somewhere in all this, I needed to get a hold of the doc right quick, especially if there were other victims. A flash of motion caught my eye, and I reached up and yanked Xanthus with his bird down beside me as a chair flew out the new opening. Pandora flapped wildly, several red feathers floating to the ground beside us. "Might want to wait a bit on prayers for the dead until we get these folks under control." "God doesn't wait," Xanthus said, passing his hands over the body while he muttered religious phrases the poor man would never hear. "God doesn't have to duck flying chairs either." "Excuse me." I stood to go help Jake. As an afterthought, I turned back. "Don't move him. If God didn't wait for prayers, who knew how long he'd wait for burial?" That's chapter 1. I am going to stop with chapter 1.
Okay.
So, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. If you have questions about traditional publishing or agents or anything along those lines, my spouse and I present all over the state. So if you have questions there, I'm also happy to answer those.
I just have one comment. You've had me at oblivion.
Yes.
I've been putting that in the first.
Middle of nowhere.
Just brought you right there. That's very vivid.
This was fun to read and write. It's always good. And I do not have a southern or western accent, so that is, it comes and goes as I try to keep it, but it's a lot of fun to read.
Who was your publisher?
My publisher is Dream Spinner Press. They are a small traditional press. They are specifically an LGBTQ press. And I am their experiment. So they were male only for the first 20 years they were in business. And they decided to branch out and include other parts of the LGBTQ community. And one of their authors recommended my work to them at the same time as my agent had just sent a manuscript to them. And so the recommendation and my manuscript landed on the owner's desk within a day of each other. And she's bought me on the spot. And then we've done 9 books together now. And 2 translations, French and German. My Nearly Departed series also has been bought by a separate publisher for audio rights only. So that's also audio in addition to print and ebook. So
Is that your first audio?
That is my only it's my trilogy, and it's in audio. And that was the only one my agent was able to resell. So one of the advantages of having an agent is that my publisher did not get to keep my audio rights. They got ebook and they got print and they got translation, but they did not keep audio. So my agent was able to turn around and resell that trilogy to an audiobook publisher for even more money than I got for the print edition, which was kind of cool. So yeah, I do have 3 in audio as well.
Audible or?
Yeah, Audible. Mm-hmm. Nearly Departed. Yeah, three books. Those 3 are set in Florida, mostly in Florida.
Why the setting in New Mexico?
I had been there, and it was gorgeous, and I spent a lot of time up on the mesas, and I had a friend who took me around to some of the original Indian cave dwellings, and Santa Fe and Albuquerque and all of those places. I got to see Taos. Absolutely loved it. I was in college at the time, and it always stuck with me. It was empty and beautiful, and I wanted to set a book there, and it made sense for the story.
Yeah, I surveyed the Monument Valley for a long time.
My best friend lived in Los Alamos, so I spent some time
I
with
was,
her.
the Four Corners area was an interesting point. I went back there recently. At the time I surveyed, the Four Corners was a monument. It was actually the wrong place, but because we did some accurate surveying.
Did you set up straight?
It was slightly off, not significant.
Okay.
But when I went back, I was amazed to see the Navajos as basically have merchandised the whole area. They have gift shops and all this sort of stuff, which I think is wonderful.
The art is just amazing.
You lost the charm of the remoteness, but at the same time, you have to recognize the importance of it in terms of economics.
Yeah.
Because as I said, I worked with the Navajos, and they were very, they dealt with the traders mostly, and they worked on a barter system. And the traders, the relationship with the Navajo was rather interesting. How the saddest story was the surpluses, government surpluses, would go to the Navajos. And flour, for example. Well, of course, water is in short supply.
Right.
So the women didn't quite know some of the women didn't know what you do with flour, except maybe face powder. So
Interesting.
It's so used. But it's an interesting area, so I agree with you.
How long have you been writing?
So I've been writing since I was 7. And then in college I started doing fan fiction, a lot of fan fiction. I've got some Ninja Turtle fan fiction out there somewhere. My name is actually in a Ninja Turtle comic, one of the original Ninja Turtle comics. I was a creative writing major in college. I left the master's program. I was supposed to be the first graduating class with an MFA when University of Miami introduced the degree. And I left because they would not let me write science fiction, fantasy, or horror. And I knew that's where I was going to go. And I could not write the great American literary novel. That is very not me. So I ended up getting a master's in literature instead with a creative writing emphasis, and did nothing with it. I'm an English teacher. That's what I've done for 29 years. Married my spouse 26 years ago. When I met them, they were like, oh, I want to also be a writer. He goes by he, they, was both a teacher and math and English. And so they started writing their novel, and I'm real competitive. So when they started writing their novel, I said, well, if you're going to write a book, I'm going to write a book. And so we chased each other up this ladder. And every contest we would enter, I would win it and he'd win it the next year. Or he would win it and I would win it the next year. And then I signed with an agent, and then he signed with an agent. And then he started selling short fiction, because that's his thing. And I started selling novels. And I had one publisher that went out of business, and then that was 2015. And then this one picked me up in 2019, and it's just been fireworks ever since.
Were you submitting short pieces or novels?
I was always, I do not have the short fiction gene. I've got one that's on submission right now, but that is not my strength. My strength is novel-length work, and I like to stay with the same characters for long periods of time. I don't want to meet them and get attached and then have them disappear in 20 pages. It just isn't me. But my spouse is a Nebula finalist, a Hugo finalist, a Locus Award finalist, and a Sturgeon Award finalist, and on the board of directors of the Science Fiction Writers of America. And they just signed their first middle grade book deal, which comes out in 2024 with Penguin Random House.
Wow. So
they're doing very, very well there. I'm happy in my little niche. I'm a very, very small niche. There's plenty of female-female romance out there, but there's very, very little science fiction romance and paranormal romance. And so when I go to LGBTQ cons,
you're it.
I'm it, and it's a nice place to be. So.
Has anybody ever solicited a script from you on any of your
No,
stories?
I'm not a
something you're
screenwriter.
interested in?
I know that
I mean, this is very visual.
I would, yes, that's every writer's dream. I would sure love to see it on screen. My agent has the film rights, and they have shopped them. We haven't had any takers yet. We'll see. Yeah.
You mentioned that the romance elements of your pieces is focal point. How explicit does your writing get, and how important is that to you think? How important do you think that is to the success of your work?
So I got braver as the books started to come out. So the first one is fairly tame. If you do like a 1 to 5 rating, I'd say it was probably around a 2, maybe a low 3. Now I'm more like a 4. The more books I put out, the hotter the scenes get. And when I do series, because I have 2 series, the first one is always the tamest, and it gets more intense as the books go on. I don't know if that is or is not a factor. I think for me, it was more about filling a vacant void where there just weren't very many books that people were looking for. I can't tell you how many people from the community come up to me and say, oh, it's science fiction, it's paranormal, and also there are people like me in it, and I can't find this anywhere. So I think that's why they do well in their field, but I don't think it's about the explicit nature of the romance scenes. I'm sure that doesn't hurt, but I don't think it's dependent one way or another, because I'm not really hot and I'm not really tame. I'm really pretty in the middle. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, I wonder if you took all the explicitness out of the books, if it would still be...
I think it would, because my books are primarily the first genre. They're primarily science fiction or paranormal, and the B plot line is the romance.
Right.
And there are very, very few sex scenes in them. There's usually 2 or 3 at the most, usually 1 around the midpoint and 1 around the end. Occasionally I will also launch with 1. But when you're talking about a 90 to 105,000 word book, and you've only got 2 sex scenes in the entire book, I mean, it's not a lot of content.
It's been my experience, though, that people either read books that have explicit scenes in them or they don't. And so if you didn't have them, then you
would I lose half my readers? I don't know. I think that they really just want to see the relationship build. I'm not sure that the explicitness is the draw as much as somebody who has similar feelings for similar people being present and doing those things.
It's just something that I've struggled with in my own writing. Like, should I put this
a romance
in, or...
factor, yes. I think that having some hint of romance or an existing romance can definitely, and it's not just from the perspective of gaining the readers. I think it's also from the perspective of making it a full-fledged story, because a lot of times I think people get so caught, I don't know anything about what you write, but I think a lot of times people get so caught up in, this is science fiction and it's all action, 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 that the human element is kind of missing. And so when you add a romance, whether it's really focused on or whether it's the background story, you've added that human emotional layer to the characters involved in the attraction. And so it humanizes the action and the drama and the excitement and the terror and the suspense to the point where I think, for me, I think readers identify better because they can relate to the emotions and not just to the action. And I always make sure that the 2 are tied really tightly. Like, the character cannot succeed in the action plot line unless they can figure out the romance plot line too. Like, they're dependent on each other. When the character's struggling with one, the character's struggling with the other, and vice versa. So it's like they have to, the emotions do affect the ability of the character to be able to carry out whatever the primary plot is. So it's something that runs through all my stuff.
Cool. All right. Elle, Ire, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. Thank you for staying and being and all that. I appreciate it.
Is that ticking caused by the